Until 1996, nobody knew what had happened to two of ancient Egypt's greatest coastal cities. Then French archaeologist Frank Godiot found them buried on a silt under the waters of the Nile Delta.
Have you ever seen a discovery so shocking that an entire control room falls completely silent? That's exactly what happened off Egypt's northern coast. What was supposed to be a routine underwater survey suddenly took a dramatic turn when a research drone drifted beyond its planned route. Seconds later, the sonar detected a massive anomaly that wasn't on any chart, map, or previous survey. Every eye in the room locked onto the monitor as an ancient structure slowly emerged from the darkness. It looked impossible, something that should have vanished forever, yet had remained hidden beneath the sea for more than 1,000 years. Before we reveal what stunned the entire expedition, make sure to hit like and subscribe, because what they uncovered next is almost impossible to believe. By the end of the mission, even veteran archaeologists struggled to explain what they had witnessed. Several members of the team admitted they all shared the same unsettling feeling. They had just watched history reveal a secret that had remained untouched for centuries. Was it a forgotten temple, a royal palace, or proof that Egypt's legendary lost city still hides mysteries capable of rewriting history? 15 miles northeast of Alexandria, just 30 feet beneath the waters of Abu Kirbeh, lies an entire submerged city. Not a shipwreck, not scattered ruins. An actual city, with streets, temples, massive harbor structures, and residential districts still recognizable after more than 1,000 years underwater. Archaeologists have recovered 64 ancient ships, the largest collection ever discovered in a single location, along with more than 700 ancient anchors. Towering statues over 10 feet tall still rest where they crashed into the seabed. Gold jewelry, bronze ritual objects, coins, and countless everyday artifacts remain preserved beneath layers of sediment, capturing the final moments of a thriving civilization. For nearly 13 centuries, the world forgot this place existed. Generations of fishermen crossed these waters unaware that an entire metropolis lay directly beneath them. Empires rose and fell, while its temples and streets remained buried in silence. And if a city this vast, with countless ships, priceless treasures, and monumental architecture, could remain hidden for over 1,000 years, then an even more disturbing question remains: what else is still buried beneath Abu Kirbeh? And what did that drone accidentally uncover that no one was ever meant to find? The city that vanished. To understand why what the drone found matters, you need to understand what this city was before it sank. The ancient Egyptians called it Thonis. The Greeks, who traded through its harbor for centuries, called it Heracleion. For roughly 1,000 years, it sat at the mouth of one of the Nile's main branches, and it controlled something enormously valuable: the front door to Egypt itself. Every merchant ship that wanted to trade with Egypt had to pass through this port first. Egyptian rivercraft, Greek trading vessels, ships from Phoenicia and Carthage, all of it funneled through Thonis-Heracleion's harbor, where officials collected taxes, inspected cargo, and decided who moved further inland and who didn't. At the center of the city stood the Grand Temple of Amun-Gereb, a religious complex significant enough to draw pilgrims from across the ancient Mediterranean. This wasn't a minor shrine. It was a major node in a religious tradition that had already been continuous in the Nile Valley for 3,000 years by the time foreign merchants started showing up in large numbers. When people talk about ancient Egypt as though it were a brief, distant footnote before Greece and Rome took over the story of civilization, This is the kind of place that quietly proves them wrong. Egypt wasn't a prelude. It was already ancient when the empires we're taught to admire were still finding their footing. For centuries, the city thrived exactly as you'd expect a wealthy port to thrive. Then, slowly, the ground it was built on began working against it. The Nile Delta is not stable ground. It's built from layers of soft sediment, deposited over thousands of years by a river that never stops moving. Cities built on the delta were, in a sense, built on borrowed time. And Thonis-Heracleion's time began running out sometime around the 2nd century BCE. Soil liquefaction, gradual subsidence, and a slow rise in sea level combined to pull the city downward, a few centimeters at a time, over generations. Buildings that had stood for hundreds of years began to tilt. Streets flooded during storms and didn't fully drain. What had been dry land, as the harbor became too shallow for larger ships, and the buildings became too unstable to maintain, the population did what populations have always done when a city stops working. They left. They moved to Alexandria, a new city built on more stable ground, one that was already rising to become the most important port in the eastern Mediterranean. And Thonis-Heracleion, abandoned by the people who once filled its streets, simply kept sinking. Not overnight. Not in a single event anyone recorded. Just quietly, over centuries, until the last rooftops disappeared beneath the waterline and the bay closed over it completely. By the time Cleopatra ruled Egypt, parts of the city were likely already underwater. By the time the Roman Empire absorbed Egypt into its territory, Heracleion existed only in a handful of ancient texts, mentioned by Greek historians, almost in passing, as a place that had once mattered and no longer did. Eventually, even those references stopped. The city didn't just sink, it was erased from the working memory of the civilizations that came after it. For 1,300 years, nobody knew where it was. Some scholars weren't even sure it had been a real place at all, rather than an exaggeration or a myth passed down through unreliable ancient sources. A city that had once controlled the gateway to one of history's most important civilizations became essentially a rumor. That's where things stood, until the year 2000, the first discovery. In 2000, a French underwater archaeologist named Franck Goddio was leading a broad survey of Abu Qir Bay, the kind of methodical, unglamorous work that makes up most of real archaeology. Sonar sweeps, magnetometer readings, slow passes back and forth across a stretch of murky water, looking for anomalies in data that most of the time turn out to be nothing. This time, it wasn't nothing. The instruments were returning readings that didn't match anything Goddio's team expected. Not the scattered signature of a shipwreck, not a random debris field. Large, structured geometric forms spread across an area far too extensive to be anything accidental. When the team sent divers down to investigate directly, what they found confirmed what the sonar had been suggesting. This wasn't wreckage. This was architecture. This was a city. Over the 2 decades that followed, Goddio's team conducted one of the most significant underwater archaeological excavations in modern history. What they recovered reshaped how historians understood this stretch of coastline. The 64 ships pulled from the site told a story of their own, a working port used by everyone, all at once, for centuries. Small rivercraft, built for navigating the shallow channels of the Nile, sat alongside larger seagoing vessels built for open Mediterranean crossings, their construction techniques showing influences from multiple shipbuilding traditions layered on top of each other. Losing a single large trading vessel in the ancient world was a genuine economic catastrophe. These ships represented years of skilled labor and enormous quantities of rare materials. Heracleon's seafloor held 64 of them, essentially undisturbed. The statues told an even more pointed story. These weren't Greek, they weren't Roman. They were unmistakably Egyptian, figures of Egyptian gods and Egyptian rulers, carved in an artistic tradition that had been developing continuously along the Nile for 3,000 years before a single Greek trader ever set foot in the harbor. The Grand Temple of Amun-Gereb, when its remains were mapped, turned out to be a religious site built by Africans for a specifically Egyptian religious tradition that had simply been open for business to whoever wanted to trade there. The popular version of this story, the one that gets repeated in most documentaries, tends to lean hard into the Greek name and the Greek merchants and the intersection of cultures at the harbor's edge. What gets left out, consistently, is that this was never a Greek city that Egyptians happened to work in. It was an Egyptian city, run by Egyptians worshipping Egyptian gods, that happened to be extraordinarily good at attracting foreign trade. By 2020, the excavation had produced enough material to fill museum exhibitions across multiple countries. And yet when Godio's team stepped back and looked at what they had actually covered, the number was almost uncomfortable. An estimated 30 to 40% of the site. That was it. Less than half. The remaining 60 to 70%, the majority of the city, had been surveyed by sonar and magnetometer, but never systematically excavated. Within that unexplored majority, the instruments had flagged multiple anomalies over the years. Areas where the readings suggested buried structures that didn't match anything in the already documented parts of the site. Places where something was clearly there. Nobody had gone to look. For years, that unexplored two-thirds simply sat, waiting for better technology, more funding, and a reason to go back. In late 2024, all three of those conditions finally lined up at once. The drone returns. The team that returned to Heracleion in 2024 had two major advantages that Godio's original survey didn't. First, the technology. The imaging systems available by 2024 could generate real-time, three-dimensional models of buried structures, reading through layers of sediment with a level of precision that made the original 2000-era sonar sweeps look like rough pencil sketches by comparison. Second, they had context. 20 years of already knowing exactly what the excavated parts of the city looked like, which gave them a far sharper sense of what counted as normal and what didn't. The drone entered the water on a morning in late 2024. In the control van on shore, a small team watched banks of monitors as the drone descended through the first 30 feet of green-tinted water and reached the sea floor. For the first stretch of the dive, everything on screen was familiar. Known structures, mapped foundations, statue fragments the team had catalogued years earlier, still lying exactly where the original excavation had left them. It was, by every account afterward, an unremarkable start to a routine survey pass. Then the drone turned toward one of the flagged anomaly zones, an area roughly 300 meters from the known edge of the main temple complex, a zone that had repeatedly returned readings nobody could fully explain using what they already knew about the site. The camera lights swept across open sediment, and then they caught something. The operator slowed the drone and held it in place. On the monitors, the lights illuminated a stretch of sea floor where the texture of the sediment looked subtly wrong, a different layering pattern than the surrounding seabed, the kind of visual signature that, to a trained eye, suggests something underneath hasn't been disturbed by natural currents the way everything around it has. And at the edge of that section, half buried in silt, was the outline of a carved stone surface, one that didn't match the construction style of anything in the already documented parts of the city. According to people who were in the control van that day, nobody spoke for close to a minute. The operator kept the drone perfectly still. Every person in the room was staring at the same feed, trying to reconcile what the camera was showing with the mental map they'd all built over years of working this site, and failing to make it fit. Eventually, someone said quietly that it didn't match, that the stone wasn't consistent with anything in the documented city, and the room went silent again, because saying it out loud made it real in a way that just seeing it hadn't. The operator eased the drone closer and adjusted the camera angle for a better view. What became clear almost immediately was that the stone wasn't just unfamiliar, it looked older. The carving style, the tool marks still visible on the surface after more than 1,000 years underwater. The construction technique itself, all of it pointed toward a period earlier than the Ptolemaic era, the Greek-influenced chapter of Egyptian history that most of the already excavated city belonged to. The Ptolemaic period began in 331 BCE, when Alexander the Great's conquest brought Greek rule to Egypt. What the drone's cameras were showing appeared to predate that boundary entirely. If that assessment holds up under the far more rigorous process of actual excavation, and the team has been careful, publicly, to stress that a drone survey alone cannot confirm something this significant, it would mean Heracleion had been occupied and actively built upon before the era the previous 20 years of excavation had focused on. It would mean the city's history reaches back further than anyone had proven, not into the cosmopolitan, Greek-adjacent Heracleion. The museums have been showing the public for 2 decades, but into the Egypt of the great dynasties, the Egypt of Tutankhamun, of Ramses, of Nefertiti. The Egypt that existed before outside influence started reshaping how the Nile Valley presented itself to the wider Mediterranean world. That distinction is not a minor technicality. It changes who gets credit for building this place and when. The part that's actually unsettling. Here's where this stops being simply an exciting discovery and starts being something closer to genuinely uncomfortable. The researcher who first flagged the anomalous stone surface in her official notes didn't reach for a dramatic word. She didn't write impossible. She used a phrase that in scientific writing carries a very specific weight, not accounted for. Nothing in the existing framework for this site explains what the cameras were showing. That phrase is what trained professionals write when the evidence in front of them doesn't fit any model they currently have. Not because the evidence is wrong, but because their understanding is incomplete in a way they didn't know about until that exact moment. Sit with what that actually means. A team that has spent 2 decades building the most detailed model of this city that has ever existed, mapping every known temple foundation, every recovered ship, every statue, pointed a camera at a routine section of unexplored sea floor, and immediately ran into something their model could not explain. Not a small discrepancy, not a minor dating question. A structure that on first read seems to belong to a version of this city's history that the excavation hasn't reached yet, sitting quietly under the sediment, less than a football field away from ground. The team thought they understood completely. And the anomaly zone, the drone investigated, is only one of multiple flagged locations across that unexcavated 60 to 70% of the site. If this one section, chosen essentially because it happened to be next in the survey rotation, turned up a structure this disruptive to the existing timeline, the obvious uncomfortable question is what the other flagged anomalies are going to show once the team gets to them. There's a version of this that stays purely academic, an interesting correction to a date range, a footnote in the next published paper. But there's another version worth sitting with, the one the team hasn't ruled out and hasn't confirmed either, that what's sitting under that unexplored two-thirds of Heracleion isn't just an older layer of the same city, but evidence of something the existing excavation was never designed to look for in the first place. A structure serving a purpose nobody has proposed yet. A layer that doesn't just push the timeline backward, but complicates why a settlement this significant existed at this exact location for far longer than anyone assumed, and what precisely made it worth continuously rebuilding on top of, dynasty after dynasty, for a span of time nobody had accounted for until a drone happened to hold its lights on the right patch of sea floor for slightly too long. That is the part that should sit with you after this video ends. Not the statues, not the 64 ships. The fact that the most advanced survey technology available today pointed a camera at a routine stretch of a site that has already been studied for 25 years and immediately found something that experienced professionals could not explain. Why this matters beyond one city. There's a bigger pattern worth naming here because it isn't unique to this one site. The story of Heracleion, as it's usually told, leans heavily on the Greek name and the Greek merchant ships and the meeting of civilizations, framing that makes for an easy documentary narrative. What tends to get pushed to the margins again and again is the fact that this was fundamentally an African city, built by Egyptians, administered by Egyptians, worshipped in by Egyptians in a religious and artistic tradition, with 3,000 years of continuous history behind it before a single foreign trader arrived. If the pre-Ptolemaic layer the drone appears to have found is confirmed, it pushes the story even further in that direction. It's evidence of Heracleion during the period when its African character was least diluted by later Mediterranean influence, a version of the city that existed before Alexander, before the Ptolemies, before centuries of Greek and Roman and Arab layers accumulated on top of the Egyptian foundation. The earlier the confirmed occupation, the more directly this site connects to the Egypt that built the pyramids, the Egypt whose descendants were later scattered across the Atlantic world through the transatlantic slave trade, the Egypt that gets treated as a footnote in classrooms that spend far more time on Greece and Rome than on a civilization that was already 3,000 years old when Greece was still developing its alphabet. That's not a minor footnote to a discovery video. That's the actual stakes of what happens when someone finally excavates that anomaly zone properly. The cliffhanger. Close. Systematic excavation of the anomaly zone is planned for the coming field season. Right now, the analysis of the 2024 drone survey data is still ongoing, and the team has been explicit more than once that nobody yet knows the full meaning of what those cameras found. Anyone telling you otherwise in this video or any other is claiming certainty the evidence doesn't currently support. But here's what we do know with total confidence. A city the world forgot for over 1,000 years has not finished giving up what it kept. Less than half of it has ever been excavated, and somewhere in the unexplored majority there is at least one structure whose age nobody can currently explain. Sitting quietly in the dark, 300 meters from ground, archaeologists have walked for 25 years, waiting for someone to come back and look at it properly. The drone is still mapping. The sediment is still holding what it's holding. And somewhere beneath Abu Qir Bay, in the 60% of Heracleion that no one has touched yet, there's an answer to a question nobody has finished asking, waiting the exact same way the entire city waited for 1,300 years until someone finally thought to look. If you want to be here when they go back down, subscribe now, because when they do, This is the channel that's going to bring it to you first.